Thank you very much. Buenos dias. Nice to meet all of you. So you've all heard the news. The world is getting warmer, about 1.15 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. This closely matches the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We know that the Earth and the oceans are able to absorb a significant amount of carbon dioxide, but that which it can't absorb stays in the atmosphere and warms the planet. We've seen sea levels rise, accelerating about a doubling of sea level rise. People blame the high intensity fires in California on climate change, the floods in Europe on climate change, the landslides, the worsening landslides in Colombia on climate change, flooding around the world, the destruction of the Great Barrier Reef, and we've seen growing alarm about plastic waste, worries about a sixth mass extinction. But the good news, we're told, is that we can solve all of this with renewables. You may have seen recently the hurricanes in the United States. The New York Times and the Financial Times published data showing a rise in hurricanes, both major hurricanes as well as overall hurricanes. And I want to suggest that while there's truth to all of this, there's more to the story that we need to consider. The first is that global carbon emissions actually declined over the last decade. This is something you wouldn't know from reading the New York Times. You can see that even in Colombia, you're already below the peak of your annual CO2 emissions, which is a fairly remarkable achievement for a developing economy. Per capita CO2 including is actually lower than what it was in 2019. The carbon intensity of energy production has been on the decline since the mid-60s. And this is following a path of developed nations around the world. The United Kingdom is at its lowest carbon emissions levels since the 19th century, France since the mid-20th century, and the United States has reduced its emissions significantly over the last 20 years. In fact, the United States reduced its emissions more than any other country in the world between 2005 and 2020. And the main reason for that was the transition from coal to natural gas, which produces about half the carbon emissions. In terms of sea level rise, it's probably the climate impact that I worry about the least. We have a significant amount of time to adapt to a half-meter sea level rise between now and the end of the century. People worry about natural disasters, but deaths from natural disasters have declined enormously over the last century. You can see that there's been a huge decline in deaths from climate and weather-related disasters, even as the human population has quadrupled in that period. There's been no increase, it turns out, in global hurricane frequency. Landfalling US hurricanes have actually slightly declined. This, by the way, all the data you can see is at the bottom of the screen. All of these slides are on my website. All of the data is drawn from either the only source or the major source of data and is published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. There's been no increase in the cost of hurricane damage when you account for growing wealth in harm's way. And that's easy to understand. If you've ever been to Miami, you can see that there's just more wealth, there's more buildings that stand to be damaged when a hurricane comes through. And this is something I want to draw attention to. When you see destruction in the world, we often attribute it to climate change, but often it's because we're wealthier, there's more development, there's just more physical environment to be harmed. The truth is that the cost of disasters at a global level has actually declined over the last 30 years. What about the landslides in Colombia? Well, there was a major study that was just published earlier this year, in March of this year, in the preeminent journal Landslides, of Colombian landslides, fatal landslides. And it's true there's been a modest increase over the last century. What the scientists found is that it's in departments with low income, high levels of corruption, and inequality are usually more affected by landslides. So you're not doomed to having landslides because there's more rain. It's true that more precipitation is one of the predicted outcomes of climate change, but more rain doesn't mean more floods or more landslides. It may mean the need to be better prepared, but there's no need to be helpless in the face of more rain. What about hurricanes? According to the two major scientific bodies that study this, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, hurricanes are actually expected to decline by 25% in their frequency, even as they intensify by 5%. What about these two graphs that the New York Times and the Financial Times created? Both were deeply misleading. On the left, you see the chart starts in 1980. You might recall I just showed you a chart of hurricanes where I started in 1900. When you start in 1900, you see there's actually been a slight decline. So if you cherry pick and you start in 1980, which is a low period, then it looks like an increase. Similarly, in the case of Financial Times on the right, what they did is they didn't correct for better reporting. This is hugely unscientific. It's journalistic malpractice. We've gotten better at detecting hurricanes because we have satellites that can detect every hurricane. In the early 20th century, it was very hard to tell when something was a hurricane, particularly if it was offshore. What about heat waves? Heat waves are definitely predicted to become more frequent as the Earth gets warmer, but in the United States, you can see we had our big heat wave, the worst heat waves were in the 1930s, not today, and in any event, deaths from heat waves are going down in the United States and around the world for one simple reason, and that's air conditioning. So once again, we're not doomed to have more suffering because the Earth is getting a little bit warmer. There is no increase in droughts in Europe. When you look at proper time spans, there's been a decline in flooding deaths in Europe. There has been a greater area flooded, but less damage. And the reason for that, and the same story basically in China, you can see declining deaths from floods, declining costs, declining flooding in Pakistan. This was something that Greta Thunberg and everybody talked about. There's supposedly more floods. In fact, this is from the best available scientific study. It was published earlier this year, a decline in floods in Pakistan. In fact, costs of disasters have been going down so much and deaths are going down that what counts as a natural disaster, which is deaths and costs, have become less frequent. So this is the only source of climate and weather disaster data. It's the Belgium MDAT data center, and you can see a decline in disasters over the last 21 years. Why are more people affected by flooding? It's because there's more people living in flood zones. You can see when you live near a river, there's more people that live there, so they're more impacted. What about sea level rise? Part of the reason I don't worry about it is because I've been to the Netherlands. This is a country that became rich by pumping water out of its below sea level areas to create farmland. In fact, you can see the change between 1900 and 2000. There's more land in the Netherlands. So we're by no means doomed to sea level rise putting us underwater. What about fires? According to the best data from NASA, the amount of the Earth that's burned over the last 20 years has declined by about 25%, an area about the size of Texas. I'm from the state of California. We know how to prevent those high-intensity fires, and we do so by clearing the forest and through prescribed burns. So we're not doomed because of slightly warmer temperatures to have these high-intensity fires. I always point out if you have a fireplace in 2 rooms in your house, the same amount of wood fuel in each fireplace, but the temperature in one room is 10 degrees higher than the other room, the height of the flames will be the same in both fires. It depends on wood fuel, not on the temperature. And we saw this in California where the fires arrive in a well-managed forest and they drop to the ground because that forest has been well managed. What about the Great Barrier Reef? Turns out it has more coral than it's ever had in the entire history of measuring coral. 36 years. To its credit, CNN ran the story describing the increase in coral. What about plastics? In my book, Apocalypse Never, I described the story of tortoiseshell glasses. I have a pair of tortoiseshell glasses. You can see the distinctive tortoiseshell design. Happily, no tortoises were harmed making my glasses, but we did almost hunt the hawksbill sea turtle to extinction by using its shell to make the original hawksbill tortoise shell glasses. So plastics actually saved wildlife. The most famous example, of course, is the elephant tusks. We used to make piano keys and billboards and billiard balls out of them. Now we use plastics. To the extent to which the plastic waste is going into the ocean, it's mostly because we attempt to recycle plastic waste, but instead of recycling it, because it's not cost effective, we send it to poor countries and it makes its way through rivers and into the ocean. So don't recycle your plastic waste. It doesn't get recycled. It should just be incinerated or landfilled. Let's take a step back and look at the relationship between energy and the environment, because the way people think about it is totally wrong. We can see that huge human success over time has meant that we have more food than ever, huge food surpluses. We see a huge increase in life expectancy in Colombia, well over 70 years. GDP has increased significantly despite a downward turn from the pandemic. More medical doctors per 1,000, malnutrition. I became very inspired by your country going through the data. Things have been improving significantly despite all that you've been through. Using less land to produce more food per person, and that allows for forests to grow back. So this is already happening in Europe. As you use more energy to produce more food on less land, that allows for marginal farmlands to return to grasslands and forests. What about climate change? We do worry that higher temperatures could hurt some farmers, but mostly what we find is that more irrigation, more fertilizer, and more tractors significantly outweigh the impact of slightly warmer temperatures. So you can see those little black dots show how much more food production we can have under climate change. Colombia, like most countries, has seen its primary energy consumption increase significantly. Most people now have access to electricity. Energy use per person has increased. Electricity consumption has increased. Per capita electricity has increased. Most people have access to clean cooking fuels, mostly natural gas or liquefied petroleum gas for cooking. That's meant a significant increase in energy consumption, gas production. And there's a story now in Colombia and around the world that you'll move to renewables. And I want to raise some questions around that. You can see here the share of electricity production from fossil fuels has been relatively steady. The share of electricity in Colombia from low carbon sources also has remained steady, mostly coming from hydroelectricity with some gas, coal, oil, and other renewables. Globally, we're seeing a big return to coal this year. And the main reason for that is that we don't have enough natural gas. When you don't have enough natural gas, you burn more coal. And part of the reason for that is that there's been a war on natural gas by climate activists that have resulted in a halving of total global investment in oil and gas. Europe now is burning wood to stay warm. They're actually logging old growth forests in Romania and elsewhere to get sufficient wood. In Denmark, people are stealing each other's wood pellets. They're so desperate for energy because of the shortage of natural gas. In Poland, people are burning trash to stay warm. That's how desperate the world is for natural gas. You can see that the Colombian peso has suffered significantly since the election of the new president. There's a lot of anxiety around the future of energy production. The president of Colombia says, we're going to move to renewables and be like California and be like Germany. Well, California actually produced more electricity, 10% more electricity from zero carbon sources in the year 2010. You can see here 100,000 gigawatts of electricity from zero carbon sources. Last year we produced 10% less. Why is that? Two reasons. We shut down our nuclear plant and we had less rain, so we didn't have as much hydroelectricity. During that same period, we added 20% of our electricity from solar. So even all of that electricity from solar couldn't make up the difference of losing a nuclear plant and a hydroelectric plant. Germany saw its peak electricity from renewables in 2020. You can see it actually went down last year, even though they did more wind, they did more solar. And the reason for that is that it just wasn't very windy in Germany last year. This is a slide that was created by Goldman Sachs. It notes that solar panels and wind turbines themselves have come down in cost, and the cost of electricity has come down as well. But everywhere in the world, renewables are used at scale. They make electricity more expensive. So you can see on the right-hand side here, on the left, it shows European power prices. On the right, how much electricity from renewables. So the more solar and wind you use, the more expensive your electricity becomes. Why is that? Well, this was brilliantly predicted by a German economist 10 years ago, and the reason is that as wind and solar become a bigger part of the grid, they cost more for two reasons. They produce too much energy when you don't need it, so you have to pay people to take that excess electricity, and they don't produce enough electricity when you do. Same thing in California. We produced too much solar in the spring. We have to pay Arizona to take our excess electricity, and then in the fall, in the summer, when it's really hot, we have to pay to import about 30% of our electricity. As a result, California saw our electricity prices rise 7 times more than they did in the rest of the United States over the last 10 years. What about batteries? The cost to back up the US electrical grid for 4 hours is about $750 billion. Nobody thinks that we're going to back up solar and wind with lithium batteries. And now the cost of lithium has increased somewhere between 3- and 7-fold, depending on when you check. The underlying problem with renewables is that they don't return enough energy on the energy invested. This was a study done by German physicists, and what they found is that where nuclear, hydro, coal, combined cycle gas turbines return a significant amount of energy for energy invested, solar, biomass, wind do not return enough energy for the energy invested. There's an underlying physical problem with renewables. Now you might think, well, that's going to change because we're going to make solar panels more efficient. They're going to convert sunlight into electricity more efficiently. But as you can see, the process of those conversion efficiencies improving is very slow. So solar panels have only gotten 3% more efficient over the last decade. So then you might ask, why then did solar panels become so much cheaper, like 75 to 90% cheaper over the last 10 to 20 years? The reason is because the Chinese aren't paying for the labor. There is about 1 million Uyghur Muslims that are in concentration camps in China. That's where their labor is coming from. It's coming from cheap coal energy and from heavy government subsidies. So we've been dealing in a bubble because of China's production of solar. There's no solution to solar panel waste. It all either goes to landfills or gets shipped to poor countries in Africa. A study in Harvard Business Review found that if the solar producers had to account for the waste byproducts, it would make solar panels 4 times more expensive than they are today. So what does all of this mean for when it comes to thinking about energy and the environment and climate change? The first is that energy consumption is tightly coupled to GDP. So there is no poor, high-energy country, and there is no rich, low-energy country. You can see Germany modestly reduced its per capita energy consumption, but definitely not to Indian, Vietnamese, or Indonesian levels. So high amounts of energy are essential to living a prosperous life. That means that the most important thing is just to dematerialize energy. It's to use energy to use less natural resource. So the classic example is your smartphone. It replaced newspapers, cameras, alarm clocks, television sets, stereo systems. It's dematerializing. It's reducing the amount of mining and materials that we need to do the same functions. And so this is the right picture from an environmental point of view. It's to move from matter-dense fuels to energy-dense fuels. This is another way of thinking about moving from solids to liquids to gases. So you move from wood and dung to coal. Coal is about 1 hydrogen atom to 1 carbon atom, to then oil, which is about 2 hydrogen atoms to 1 carbon atom, to natural gas, which is CH4, 1 carbon atom, 4 hydrogen atoms, eventually to nuclear and hydrogen. This is the basic vision that energy analysts have had since the 1960s and 70s, but we've gotten off on this strange path around renewables. You can see that we've been reducing our carbon intensity for over 150 years, just given that transition from wood to coal to oil to natural gas. This has been the biggest driver of reductions in air pollution, moving to cleaner sources of energy. Those energy sources are burning hotter and cleaner. So to go back to renewables would be a process of going back to more matter-intensive and land-use-intensive fuels. You can see that in California. You need 300 to 400 times more land to produce the same amount of electricity from solar as you do from nuclear, 400 times more land for wind than from nuclear. And you can see this transition from a conventional car at the top to an electric car requires significantly more material throughput. So anybody that's talking about moving from oil to electric cars has to take into account the significant increases, really a seven-fold increase of mining and material throughput that's going to drive up the costs and make electric cars unviable economically compared to today's vehicles. And you can also see from a strategic perspective, it means becoming heavily dependent on China, as opposed to being able to rely on your own energy resources. This is obviously important when you think about Europe, which had become so dependent on Russia for oil and natural gas imports. Nations need to have their own secure resources. Anybody saying that you can just trust Venezuela for your oil, I think is pulling one over on you. You need to have your own energy resources to have your own national security. You can see China's domination of the sector is across the board. So why did everybody get it wrong? I think there's a few reasons. Journalists, and I am one, have an incentive to use fear to sell catastrophic perception of climate change. This is an article that came out the year I graduated from high school. UN predicts disaster if global warming not checked. Whole nations will be wiped off the face of the earth by the year 2000. This is from 1989. There's a kind of narcissism in believing that after 200,000 years, or maybe 2 million years, depending on the archaeologists, of human existence, that the world's going to come to an end in my lifetime, and I am uniquely positioned to save the world for all of you. I think there's a sense of entitlement, a kind of sense in which the world, that these difficulties are not something that we should have to confront, that the world owes us something. There's, I think, a role of fantasy, of harmonizing with the natural world. It's a spiritual quest. And then a kind of more hard-edged nihilism, this desire to really destroy Western civilization and its underlying bases in energy. The alternative is abundance. If we really care about all humans on Earth, then nobody should have to use wood as their cooking fuel. Everybody should have access to clean cooking fuels. We see what happens in countries like Sri Lanka when they don't have abundant energy, fertilizer, and food. There's riots, governments fall. This is with the risk of what's happening to Pakistan right now. Even in rich countries like Europe, when you don't have your own dependable energy resources, people go cold and you have a significant deindustrialization. So the solution is domestic production. This is what the United States has been pursuing, should continue to pursue, despite having some setbacks over the last few years. This is clearly, I think, a lesson for everybody, that you need to have your own energy resources to be secure. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Michael.